India and Japan. They have long shared a close bond, stretching back to ancient times through Buddhism, Hinduism, and trade, all the way through to modern times, where they enjoy thriving economic, military, and cultural ties. In many ways, for well over 1,000 years, India and Japan have been inseparable. In the first half of the 20th century, there were three Indians who were responsible for bringing India and Japan together in the fight against Western colonization. They were Rash Behari Bose, Radhabinod Pal, and A.M. Nair. Their contributions were widely acknowledged by the Japanese, with each of these men being awarded with the highest medals of honor existing in Japan. The story of these three great figures all began with the Japanese victory over Russia in the Russo-Japanese War in 1905. These were the days of European imperialism, when Great Britain was the largest empire in the world and in history, engulfing over 20% of the Earth's total land area and holding power over approximately 20% of the world's population. And Russia had been expanding its empire from the north, invading what is now known as Korea and China. Essentially, all of the world's land areas had been colonized and taken by force by European powers, with the exception of Japan. This meant that Japan was not neighboring other Asian nations as such, but rather was surrounded by lands under the possession of Western colonial powers. In those days, Asia did not comprise independent countries. It was only seen as an enormous mass of land over which Western imperialist powers were competing. Asia was almost entirely composed of colonies of Great Britain, Germany, the Dutch, Portugal, Russia, the US, and France. There were neither Asian government bodies nor military forces in place to protect their people. The only exception to all of this was Japan. Never having been colonized and an independent nation with her own governing body, when Japan successfully defended herself from Russia, demonstrating her military strength, it was a massive moment of awakening throughout Asia. They realized that they too could pick up weapons, ousting the Europeans from their land and establishing their own independent nations. Rash Behari Bose was one of the very first Asians to take action, seeking Japanese assistance in fighting against British imperialism in India. Bose arrived in Japan in June of 1915 at the age of 29, with absolutely no command of the Japanese language. Until this time, he had been actively engaged in the Indian independence movement back home and was the chief organizer of the Delhi bombing of December 1912 and the Lahore Mutiny of February 1915. Wasting no time, Bose quickly picked up the Japanese language as soon as he arrived in Japan and became acquainted with many influential politicians and socialites in Japan, among whom were Toyama Mitsuru and people associated with Genyosha, a pan-Asian secret society in Japan that was focused on saving Asia from the hands of European colonizers. Bose published 17 books and about 40 articles in the Japanese language explaining India's plight under British imperialism. He also traveled throughout Japan, delivering talks and meeting great numbers of the Japanese population. Listening to the hardships of the Indian people firsthand from an Indian man speaking in fluent Japanese proved to be a very popular and effective method for spreading awareness among the public. Bose quickly became famous and appeared in major newspapers on an almost daily basis. Rash Behari Bose lived in Japan and dedicated his life to Indian independence for the next 30 years without ever, even once, being able to set foot on Indian soil until he passed away in Tokyo on January 21st, 1945, after suffering a massive brain seizure. During his time living in Japan, Bose married a Japanese woman. He took up Japanese citizenship and had 2 children. Until August of 1923, Japan had been an ally of Britain under the Anglo-Japanese alliance signed in 1902, and as such, Japan was obligated to be on the side of British colonial forces and was not in a position to provide full support to India's independence effort. However, as a direct result of the Four-Power Treaty of 1921, signed by Britain, France, the US, and Japan, the allyship between Japan and Britain was deliberately brought to an end in 1923, freeing up Japan to give her full support to Bose in his fight for Indian independence. Shortly after this, in September of 1923, Bose lost everything in the devastating Great Kanto earthquake, which ravaged Tokyo and the surrounding prefectures throughout the Kanto region. However, his work was never stalled. Bose established the Indian Independence League on January 26, 1930, the day on which the Indian National Congress declared total Indian independence. Bose's Indian Independence League was the main organization in the fight for freedom, and subsequently, Bose also established the Indian National Army in June of 1942 under the IIL. Bose held 3 conferences with the goal of uniting Indians who were residing outside of India. These were the Tokyo Conference in March of 1942, the Bangkok Conference in May 1942, and the Singapore Conference in early 1943. Bose was the key figure in the Pan-Asian Conference of 1926, at which delegates of India, China, Afghanistan, Annam, and the Philippines discussed Asian independence from Western powers. India had already been under the grip of the British Empire for over 300 years, and most of the elite in positions of power were siding with Britain by that time, as they had been enjoying British privileges and favor for generations. Bose's persistent effort to achieve Indian independence fell short as a result of this. The Indian independence movement was riddled with Indians who were acting as British spies and were actively jeopardizing any efforts made by Bose. In contrast, the Japanese were in full support of Bose and granted him almost everything that he requested. On December 8, 1941, Japan declared war on Britain, and shortly after, on the US. 20 days later, on December 28th, Bose's Indian Independence League declared war on Britain. On February 15, 1942, Prime Minister Tojo Hideki announced Japan's total support of the Indian Independence League. From November 1944 to August 1945, Britain and the US carried out a scorching annihilation of Japan, destroying every major city, including the dropping of 2 devastating nuclear bombs, the likes of which have never before or after been used on human beings. Rash Behari Bose died in the midst of this indiscriminatory bombing campaign, in great sorrow, realizing that the independence that he had spent his life dreaming of and fighting for would not come true. In those days, this war was known as the Greater East Asia War, a war fought by Asians against Western imperialism. But now it is known as the Pacific War or World War II. It was so named by the US and Britain after the defeat of Japan, which claimed over 3 million lives and the complete and total destruction of cities and all life forms. The end of the war was marked by the infamous International Military Tribunal for the Far East, the purpose of which was to eternally vilify Japan and vindicate any wrongdoings of Britain and the US. Of the 11 judges who attended the tribunal, Justice Radhabinod Pal of India was the only lawyer who was actually qualified in international law. Among all of the judges, he was the only one to submit a judgment insisting that none of the Japanese defendants on trial were guilty. And in his dissent, he referred to the trial as not being in pursuit of impartial justice, but it was a sham employment of legal process for the satisfaction of a thirst for revenge. Pal was a great admirer of Rash Behari Bose and appointed A.M. Nair, the closest associate of Rash Behari Bose, to be his own assistant, translator, and advisor. It has now been 78 years since Japan was defeated in the war, and as of yet, there are still only Justice Pal's reason of judgment to exonerate her from wrongdoing. Rash Behari Bose's dream of complete and total decolonization will live on in the historic judgment of Justice Radha Binod Pal.